This is Speaking of Writers. I'm Steve Richards. The book is The Path to Break Free From Burnout. The author, Amy Mangueira, recently recognized by the NYC Journal as a top life coach to watch out for in 2022. Amy Mangueira helps people all over the world live burnout-free by bringing clarity, direction, and positive habits into their lives by filling the gap between where they are now and where they want to be. An entrepreneur with successful acquisitions under her belt, Amy has turned her focus to Humans First Coaching, a coaching network dedicated to guiding over 300 leaders and organizations on how to build healthy cultures, reduce burnout, take care of themselves, and put their employees first. She also has a custom jewelry company that creates fine jewelry for runners, Victory Co. Amy is also the author of The Path to Break Free From Burnout and creator of the Break Free From Burnout framework. Happy to have Amy Mangueira join me now here on Speaking of Writers. Amy, welcome to this program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's start with the term burnout. Define that.
Yeah, I love this question. So let me just kind of tell you my perspective on the term in general. I think that I'm feeling burned out. And I think that that is a common feeling we have as humans in our lives multiple times. And I think that I'm feeling burned out is a typical sign that a change needs to be made, right? That maybe we've been doing the same thing year over year. Our schedule hasn't changed. Maybe we need to change it up. Maybe it's a cry for vacation or, taking our PTO. And so we often as humans feel burned out. But when the chronic stress isn't taken care of and we are in the stress cycle more than we're not, we start to move into burnout syndrome. And in my book, I talk about the 5 stages, but burnout syndrome is when we start to say, okay, little by little, I am moving down this ladder of suffocation. I'm starting to be depressed. I might have physical symptoms associated. The stress might be affecting my sleep, the way that I'm eating my food. It might be causing me actual physical health issues. Likely I'm depressed. I'm starting to become cynical. And while burnout typically starts in one facet of our lives, it does start to cascade through other facets once we get into burnout syndrome. And so when folks reach the bottom of burnout syndrome, they're typically really depressed, and it's really hard at that stage to kind of break free and make the change that we might have been able to make when we were just feeling burned out. So I always like to talk about those 2 delineations of the term because we are using the term burnout in society right now. It's like a buzzword for sure.
You're also the host of the self-care podcast, Life on My Terms, bringing in thousands of listeners from across the world, and you chat with experts to help listeners become 1% better and take charge of their lives. You're also an avid runner, too. You are also an Abbott 6 World Major Marathon Series finisher, amongst the first 1K women to complete the series. When she isn't running, you volunteer as a coach and program sponsor for Girls on the Run, a national non-for-profit organization dedicated to strengthening girls' social, emotional, physical, and behavioral skills to successfully navigate life experiences through running. So let's talk about the stages a little more. How do they affect you?
Yeah, so I really like to think of the stages of burnout syndrome as kind of like you would your phone battery, right? Like when you're entering stage 1 of burnout syndrome, you've got this phone that's got just a ton of apps working all over for different purposes. It's kind of like my bio you just read, like all the things that I am juggling in my day. So I've got the 45 plus hour week. I've got the home life, all of my personal goals. There's just all this stuff I'm always doing. I like to refer to it as chasing busy. But when we're initially at the top and we're not quite in the depths of burnout syndrome in stage 1, we're almost willing to be overcommitted because in some ways we're proving our worth, right? So we've got this phone, it's got all these cool apps and we're just using it to max capacity. Well, as we start to move into stage 2 and 3, we start to see those chronic stress moments. We're starting to get the fight or flight responses multiple times a day. We might have now sort of changed our focus on what we want for ourselves, and we've moved into what we want for other people. So in work, this happens a lot because we feel that in order to prove our worth at work, we have to overwork. We have to maybe over-exceed expectations. If the team's short, we want to take extra work on. And so we start to be in the chronic stress stages a little bit too often. And so in stage 2, we're starting to experience the fight or flight is happening a lot more chronically. When we start to get to stage 3, we might start to notice some physical symptoms like tension, starting at a particular time of day, or when a certain thing happens, you get a certain response. For instance, maybe your boss calls you randomly throughout the day and you start to get this tension in your neck, or you immediately get a tension headache. Those are all signs that stress is very much present on an ongoing basis. So we're starting to get physical symptoms. A lot of my clients tell me in stage 3 that they can't digest food. They're getting a lot of indigestion, headaches. Some complain about having a fat layer they can't get rid of, and they, say, I haven't changed my eating and I'm working out like crazy. And so when we start to get into stage 4, that's when the cynicism and we start to get into those mental and emotional components. We're usually so deep at that point that we don't even have the capacity to process the feelings that we're having. And so we're suppressing them everything's fine. I've got this, don't worry. But inside we're starting to crumble and deteriorate. And if we go back to the phone example, it's kind of like when you've had your phone for a while and you need a charge in the middle of the day to even get it to get restored and back to power. So I like to think of stage 4 is when we now have the physical ailments and we're putting that happy face on just to continue and push through. And likely we're starting again to maybe have outbursts, we're frustrated and it's coming out somehow. It might be to our spouse, it might be to our boss. And then stage 5 is really where some of the health conditions can get really, really intense. For me, I was having chronic nightmares that were causing me not to hardly sleep at all. I was basically an insomniac. Your physical symptoms, a lot of times my clients' white blood cell counts are through the roof. They are have this inflammation out of control. And the depression's really where this can set in pretty heavy. And I also would layer in something I like to call burnout brain. And it's basically decision fatigue. And I don't know anybody out there listening, but a simple decision like, hey, honey, what do you want to have for dinner tonight? Can be literally a paralyzing feeling. And this is the scariest stage because this is where we can kind of lose hope and we start to have that absolute thinking behavior, where you're this can't happen, I can't change, I'm in this forever. There's almost no problem solving available because we're so tired and exhausted and we're not putting ourselves first. And this is really in the back to the phone example where we probably need to buy a new phone. It's not working anymore. So that's kind of how I would describe the stages.
We're chatting with Amy Mangueira here on Speaking of Writers. Her new book is The Path to Break Free From Burnout. It is available at writersrepublic.com, barnesandnoble.com, and amazon.com as well. Let's talk about tactics now. What about some tactics to start to break free?
Yeah, so the very first thing I like to say, and the easiest one to get started, especially if you're in stage 5, is take just a day or two to notice anything that you say that is some sort of a complaint or can address a stress trigger. So for instance, the easiest one, immediately after your day of work, do you go to your partner and start to tell them all of the things that you're so frustrated about that happen in your day? Those items likely can correlate back to a stress trigger that is a repeated behavior that is causing you chronic stress. The first thing is we have to write these down. So even if you identify 1 or 2, you are light years ahead of starting to pull yourself out of this syndrome and starting to regain kind of your path. So we want to write those down. We then want to ask ourselves, okay, what boundary can I put in place to protect myself but also retrain the people that are violating my boundary or my time. And so a really easy example is, imagine you have a boss that constantly puts meetings on your calendar back to back to back, or everybody at work just doesn't care about you having any white space. And so you have every single day, you have 8 hours back to back. You have no time to do any of your work. So it's causing long work hours, etc. You can put a boundary in place that says, I'm going to block my calendar multiple chunks each day of the week. And the boundary is that I'm going to let people know that they have to book around my blocked time. And so right there, you've regained control of one small facet. It might be small, but the amount of energy that's going to return to you is incredible. So that's the first way to start. Then we've got to start to layer on those self-care pillars. What are the facets of your self-care that you're failing? When I was in burnout, I was like missing every meal between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. I was going like all day with no snacks, no lunch. So when I started to think about the tactics I needed to improve and get myself stronger and back to me, the very first self-care pillar I had to look at was nutrition. How can I just start to eat 3 meals a day? And then from there, I layered in some snacks. And then from there, I was able to say, let's tackle sleep. So we have to start small, and we have to start by identifying ways to give ourselves some energy and time back, so we have the ability to A, think clearly, and B, go into those self-care pillars that are ultimately going to make the long-lasting resilience we need in the end.
Amy, what about the power of our choices?
Oh, gosh. Well, this is either something that people find as an epiphany, or I trigger them, and they're very frustrated by this. But thank you for asking. The power of our choices, it's a hard realization when you have been buried in burnout syndrome to not feel a victim. And when you pull yourself out and you really start to do the work, you start to layer in the boundaries, you realize that a good majority of the time, you actually made choices that put yourself in the positions you were in. And so I started to appreciate that the greatest human superpower we all have is the power to choose. We can choose, and we can also choose how we react to things. And so a lot of the times we like to blame it's this, it's that. And it might be that you have a very toxic boss. There's nobody saying that's not true, but the way that we react and the way that we still get to choose how we respond to that is our choice. And so we have to remember that when we're sitting and we're feeling completely glum and we're totally burnt out, we have to look at our choices. What choices are we making that have put us in this position? And a lot of us that are in burnout syndrome or are sensitive and susceptible to burnout, these are folks that typically are the chasers of busy. That's the category I like to call them. It's the folks that even when they get a little bit of time back or energy back, they fill it immediately with something else because their fulfillment comes with checking all of these boxes. And so being able to see that that is the root of the problem and that you're choosing to sort of put yourself in the passenger seat of your own car and let everybody else drive the car for you is one of the biggest ways that we move out of burnout. But I will say that this is the key to actually being resilient to it happening over and over and over again in your life.
Amy, what would you like readers to take away from this book?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think the first big thing that I would like readers to take away is that they have got to find a place where they understand that putting themselves first is the most important thing. And for whatever reason, it doesn't matter how many times we read it or say it or hear it, it's still really hard to do. And if we can just remember the very common example of putting on your oxygen mask first before your child in an airplane, we understand that if we are not alive and able to be available, we cannot help those that we love. And it's the same here. When you're exhausting yourself to the point of, physical, mental, emotional disadvantage, you cannot be the best mother, the best spouse. You can't be a good friend. You can't be the best you that you want to be anyway. And so I really do want readers to be able to take that away and really do the work, figure out who are they, what do they love to do, what lights their soul on fire. Maybe they find out that it's not even aligned to their current career path. And maybe it ignites a little fire inside of them to start a hobby or start a small business that they love because they really like sewing and they're doing admin work, And so I really want folks to understand that it is like it's not being selfish to care about yourself and to make sure that you're running 100%. And then the only other thing I would say that I would love readers to take from this book is I think a lot of times, like I know for me, all of these entrepreneurial adventures that I've taken have all been like, how much money can I make and success. And so I think that we have this society of like the hustle culture. And I'd love to like turn that on its head because the more research you do and you really look into like entrepreneurs that have hit rock bottom and hit burnout, they will tell you that, when you're reaching those monetary milestones, you're constantly in this mindset of like, what's next? It's like you're constantly chasing the next thing or the next milestone. But what you're really lacking the entire time, though, is the fulfillment. And so being able to marry those up and find some balance where you're not putting off the things that you love because you're chasing this goal that will ultimately have you dying at your desk due to stress, is super important. And I just want readers to know that it's okay to take some time to figure out what you're passionate about. And if it even causes you to change careers, like that is okay to do. We're allowed to change because we're not the same people we were even 5 years ago.
Some great advice from Amy Mangueira, and the book is The Path to Break Free from Burnout. It is available at writersrepublic.com, barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, and you can check her out on her Life on My Terms podcast, too. Amy, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
And this is Speaking of Writers.